Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly? Are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Okay, let's get started. All
Okay.
right. Well, welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Newberger. I'm a professor of history at UT Austin and the director of our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And Kirill is my co-host.
Thank you very much, Mary. Today we're running a bonus episode, bonus track, which is a very pleasant surprise for the audience, the regulars, and for people that will be watching this on our YouTube video channel. My name is Kirill Avramov. I'm an assistant professor of political science, and I also am part of the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I belong to the same center as Mary, and I am very grateful for her leadership of the center for so many years. So thank you, Mary. Today we're having something very interesting and I believe quite timely. So today we're having Németh Ferenc, who will be talking about the challenges and challengers to illiberalism in Serbia and Hungary. So spot on. You know, it's a very high time to talk about politics, especially in the wake of the Hungarian election, which is upcoming and the whole world is watching it. And Ferenc is very well positioned to talk about this topic because he is a Fulbright visiting student researcher at Georgetown University. He is also a PhD candidate at Corvinus University of Budapest, a well-established academic institution. He was also a visiting international graduate student at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the U of T, University of Toronto, and has conducted research at Svetiki Metodi University, or Stensiros Metodius University in Skopje. He is a research fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and most importantly, he also worked at EU-Lex Kosovo, which tells me that he has a lot of field experience for what he'll be talking about. He was a Denton Fellow at the Center of European Policy Analysis and participated in the Transatlantic Security Initiative of the International Republican Institute. His specific areas of expertise include Western Balkans, EU enlargement and security studies. So, Ferenc, welcome. And we are thrilled to have your talk today, as I really mean it. It is timely, it is important, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people, even in the passing days, been asking me and Mary on the hallways of our university what is going on. There are, a lot of important things happening. So we are thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much, Kirill, and also Mary, for your warm welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from DC. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen and then we can start my presentation. Just give me a sec, or maybe 2 seconds. If I'm not mistaken, at this point, you can see my screen and the presentation.
Yes, the
Yep.
setup looks
Yeah.
perfect.
Awesome. So in today's discussion, I'm going to briefly introduce one of my research that I'm currently doing that is entitled Challenges and Challengers to Illiberalism in Serbia and Hungary. But before going into, like details and the challenges and the challengers of illiberalism in Serbia and Hungary, I find it very important to define what we mean under a hybrid regime or an illiberal regime, and I will also explain why this topic matters right now, especially right now in 2026, in April 2026 to be more precise. After that, I'm going to also briefly introduce the current state of affairs in Serbia and Hungary, basically how we got there, where we are now. And I will put the emphasis on explaining the similarities and differences that the Serbian student-led protests or movement and Péter Magyar from Hungary do seem to have or possess in challenging the long-lasting reigns of the current Serbian and Hungarian regimes. And last but not least, since this is a mainly American audience and we are in the US, both in person and virtually, I would dedicate some time to elaborate on the bilateral relations between the US and Hungary, and US and Serbia after the return of Trump to the Oval Office, and how that may shape the election results even in Hungary in next Sunday. So let's get to, let's say, the definitions or the theoretical backbone theoretical framework of this presentation. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to use either the term hybrid regime or illiberal regime. When using these terms, I'm going to use them as broadly as possible. Under an illiberal regime, I will mean a democracy that I will understand a system that from the outside or on the surface looks like a democracy, but it doesn't meet the democratic standards in practice. So when we scratch the surface, or in many cases we don't even need to scratch the surface, we will realize that those regimes are far from the democratic standards, or let's say the Western democratic standards established through the decades and also acknowledged by scholarship. Yet I know that my kind of definition is extremely broad, so I try to rely on the shoulders of the big guys, of esteemed scholars in defining what illiberal democracy might entail in more detail. Illiberal democracy in its essence means, according to Zakaria, that in a system where elections do take place, do exist, but liberal constitutional principles don't function properly. That means that there are mechanisms, there are institutions in place with the aim of safeguarding democracy and democratic principles, but they are either not functioning properly or they are actively used and abused by the system itself or by the regime itself to be able to maintain or cement its position for a longer run. This definition is good enough, but not good enough according to recent literature to describe the Serbian and Hungarian cases. Scholarship in the past decades or so classifies or labels the Hungarian and Serbian regimes as either a competitive or an electoral autocracies. In a competitive autocracy, democratic institutions exist and elections are held. I shall also add that elections are free, but those in power usually abuse the resources, the central resources, and manipulate the rules to stay in control. Once again, that means that elections are held freely, they are not fair at all, and there are institutions that on paper should safeguard democratic values and checks and serve as a kind of checks and balances, but in reality they purposefully don't fulfill these kind of positions or authority in the system. Another approach is that usually Hungary gets labeled as an electoral autocracy, which means that once again there are elections. Elections take place on a regular basis, but those elections are systematically manipulated so that the ruling party or the leader cannot realistically lose power. In the Serbian and especially in the Hungarian context, that looks like as follows. So elections are taking place, they are free but definitely not fair. The electoral law has been redesigned, retailored in a way that it favors the largest party or the party in power, notably that is Orbán Viktor's Fidesz party. And also there have been a lot of gerrymandering taking place in recent decades, which also only benefits the largest party or the party in power. So this is the kind of situation slash theoretical backbone that this entire presentation is based on. Labeling or classifying Serbia and Hungary as definitely not democracies, but rather as systems in between a competitive and electoral autocracies. And what makes this research interesting, not only to, let's say, to a group of people interested in the Western Balkans and Central Europe, but to a more wider audience, is the fact that Serbia and Hungary don't only share similar history and background, they are not only neighboring countries, but they are pretty much in the same boat when it comes to being illiberal regimes, which is a good starting point in conducting a more comparative analysis on these two systems. And what is more interesting to me, and this is where I'm going to put the emphasis on today, is that there have been serious challengers to the regime, and we'll see to the entire system as well from the past 2.5 years, which gives me an ample of opportunity to discuss the similarities and differences, the similar and different approaches that different political actors or social movements can take in order to put the first coffins into the regime's, put the first nails into the regime's coffin. To be more precise, not to be like this abstract, I'm going to discuss the student-led protest or movement in Serbia, and I'm going to compare that and contrast it as well with the rise and the dominance of Péter Magyar's Tisza party in Hungary. And like Kirill mentioned in the beginning or in the introduction, this presentation is extremely timely since last Sunday local elections took place in Serbia and 10 municipalities and election results and the way elections were handled on that day received a lot of backlash, not only locally but internationally, the way they were handled, the violence that followed in some places or some instances, but also from a more, let's say, like personal point of view, parliamentary elections in Hungary are going to take place next Sunday, which are not only going to be the make it or break it elections of, let's say, my generation, but also it has already received quite a significant local, national, and international news coverage and scholarly interest as well. So let's dive into, let's say, the first chapter of this presentation. That is basically how we got the question of how we got there and how can we conceptualize Hungarian-Serbian relations and how the regime functions. What is interesting, or what we should all know about Hungary, is that in the past 16 years, it is led by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. He has been in power since 2010. I wasn't eligible to vote in 2010, so that's kind of a long time also for me to think about it. A long time in Hungarian political history for sure. And let's not forget the past, that this is not the, let's say, 2010 wasn't the first time when Orbán Viktor got elected as prime minister. He also served as the country's premier between 1998 and 2002, which means that he has been in power for 16 years in a row. But if we look at it from a broader perspective, he has been the prime minister of Hungary for more than 20 years, surpassing all predecessors, not only from modern day Hungary, but going back until ancient times as well. On the other hand, Hungary, a small landlocked country in Central and Eastern Europe, was once hailed as a success story when it came to getting out of the socialist bloc, when it came to the democratization processes and adopting the standards, the institutional and democratic standards for a well-functioning state and a well-functioning market economy back in the 1990s. And as a testament to the success of democratization, Hungary was one of the first countries from Central and Eastern Europe, a kind of a trailblazer, to join NATO in 1999 as part of NATO's very first enlargement to post-socialist countries, along with Czechia and Poland. And Hungary was also among the 10 countries to join the European Union back in 2004. So what we can say is that from the 1990s up until the end of the Euro-Atlantic integration process of Hungary, the country did very well, or relatively well, in a more regional perspective, from a regional perspective or comparison. But ever since Viktor Orbán came into power, he basically and very quickly changed the rules of the game, demolishing democratic institutions, well-established democratic institutions, changing the electoral law, changing the constitution, or actually rewriting the constitution and adopting a new one on many occasions, which has resulted in not only the deterioration of democratic standards in Hungary, but also that this kind of process saw Hungary finding itself as one of the poorest countries in the EU as of today. Similar tendencies took place in Serbia as well in the past decade or so. Aleksandar Vučić came to power 10 to 12 years ago, depending on which position you might consider him taking the power or taking the lead in the country. But what really matters in the Serbian context, and this is a difference between Hungary and Serbia, is that Serbia had not only a delayed democratization, but only a partial one that only took place after 2000. And it goes without saying that the biggest problem or the biggest obstacle in the 1990s when it came to Serbia's democratization was the breakup of Yugoslavia and the armed conflicts and the nationalist rule of Milosevic that basically accompanied the breakup or disintegration of Yugoslavia. Partial democratization only took place in the beginning of 2000s, and I wouldn't be so certain, and I'm certain to say that only institutions that that should have been responsible for safeguarding democracy didn't fully develop, or didn't develop to an extent that had developed in other countries of the region, in Croatia or Hungary in particular. And even when it comes to the Euro-Atlantic integration process of Serbia, the country is not that institutionalized into the transatlantic community as, for example, Hungary has been. Case in point, Serbia, at least on paper, declared its military neutrality back in 2007. And for a long time now, it has been an official candidate country of the European Union without any clear chances of joining as a full-fledged member anytime soon. Once again, we can talk about the rule of law deficiencies as one of the greatest obstacles. Also, the unresolved nature of Kosovo is a stumbling block in that sense, but also, and more recently, Serbia's unalignment or non-alignment with the EU's common foreign and security directives is yet again an obstacle in getting closer to EU. So this is where we are now. We have two systems, pretty much similar one, led by two quite influential and many people would argue charismatic leaders who share a lot of similarities. One of the similarities includes that their systems are pretty much centralized in terms of who says what or where the real power concentrates. It's a very leader-centric governance, which means that it is Orbán and it is Vučić respectively who calls the shot when it comes to external affairs or foreign affairs issues as such. And also those systems can be characterized as the expression of state capture, which means that both countries face the same challenges when it comes to rule of law issues, including limited judiciary independence, reduced parliamentary oversight, not to mention the lack of media freedom. Obviously, it doesn't mean that judiciary doesn't work at all, but there are serious political pressures on judges and prosecutors to deliver their work according to certain political desires. And obviously doesn't mean that those countries don't have independent media. But once again, those outlets and those journalists face with a lot of either financial burdens or face with an environment that is pretty hostile towards them and towards their work as well. Last but not least, another very important similarity between the two regimes or the two leaders is that they both share the same narratives. They rely on identity politics in order to first of all, boost their popularity, but also to hide the real issues, the real economic and structural issues that their countries are facing with. And when it comes to the narratives, oftentimes they are very much against the West, the collective West, especially the EU, and topics that they are very fiercely care about includes migration and anti-gender policies as well. So it seems that there are a lot of synergies, not only between the system, but between the two leaders and the two countries as well. So when it comes to bilateral relations, it's very interesting for me is that relations are still very much highly personalized, which means that leader-to-leader relations are the driving forces between the current bilateral relations between Serbia and Hungary. And these kind of highly personalized political elite-led relations haven't really translated into people-to-people relations, let alone to other segments of the society. Which, just to give you an idea or an example, if you would go to Vojvodina, the northern province of Serbia, and ask Hungarians and Serbs what do they think of each other, you would find a lot of mistrust and distrust among different ethnicities and nationalities, because it's one thing that their leadership are best buddies for more than a decade now, but their cooperation hasn't been that deep, so in a way that the average citizens of Serbia or Hungary would have been able to benefit from it. The only, let's say, like circles that benefit from this cooperation are either the leaders or the political and economic hinterland that is behind those leaders. And the means of cooperation are manifold. It includes the energy sector, especially nowadays. Both countries are pretty much reliant on Russian fossil fuels, fight against illegal migration, although in Hungary we haven't seen migrants since 2015. And also there are a lot of economic cooperation going on, especially Hungarian companies, either state-owned or owned by people very close to the regime, entering the Serbian market. And also what is very important from a scholarly point of view is that when it comes to the relations between Vučić and Orbán, we oftentimes mention their so-called illiberal alliance. In addition, we can also, mention Dodik from Republika Srpska, but also Vladimir Putin from Russia as part of this growing liberal alliance within the Balkans or within South Central and Eastern Europe, trying to undermine democratization processes, but also EU and NATO expansion or the broader stability of the Western Balkans as such. And one question that I always ask to myself when I have some sleepless nights is basically like, who benefits more from this cooperation? Is it Orbán? Is it Vučić? Or are these means of cooperation mutually beneficial? And I would argue is that both leaders are beneficiaries of this cooperation. For Orbán, it's good to have an additional body, part of his ever-growing European illiberal alliance, or transatlantic illiberal alliance, I should say. But other than that, the support of Vučić doesn't really translate into anything, let's say, like politically beneficial for Orbán. It is rather the illiberal alliance he is building, and also the economic benefits that Serbia can provide to Hungarian companies often affiliated with Orbán. On the other hand, For Vučić, Orbán is extremely important because Hungary is a member of the European Union. If things go south, if the European Union wanted to somehow sanction Vučić's Serbia, the regime itself, because, for example, the rule of law situation, Orbán's veto can safeguard, or because of Orbán's veto, it wouldn't be able to properly establish any kind of sanctions or whatsoever on Serbia. So I would say, and this case applies also to Republika Srpska's Dodik as well. So in a case, Hungary can serve as a spoiler power within the EU in safeguarding Serbia's and Republika Srpska's interest as such. So there are some benefits, but I would say for now it is more, their relations are more beneficial for Vučić, or has been more beneficial for Vučić than for Orbán. But things are changing. And things are changing in both regimes and in both countries, and mainly because in the past 2.5 years, there have been some challengers who might successfully challenge the regimes or the powers of Orbán and Vučić respectfully. In Serbia, that group of challengers came to know as the student-led protest or movement. And in Hungary, we can talk about Péter Magyar, the prominent opposition leader who, after 16 years of Orbán being in power, will have a clear shot, or let's say a real chance at toppling Orbán in next Sunday's election. So in this part of the presentation, let me give you some similarities between the student-led protest and let's say the rise of Péter Magyar, because from the outside it seems that it is only the timing that is similar between the two phenomena, if you will. But if we go into the details, there are many, let's say, like similarities and also synergies between the two of them. If not direct synergies, but indirect ones. Even the starting point is very much similar, because the rise of the student-led protests as well as Péter Magyar was triggered by a significant event, which means that we can actually pinpoint to a certain place and a certain time in the political history of both countries that gave the opportunity or gave the access to both movements to have an impact. In Serbia, that took place on the 1st of November 2024, when a railway station canopy collapsed in Novi Sad in northeast, north-south, in the northern part of Serbia in Vojvodina, took 16 lives. And resulted in the emergence of mass protests, not only in Novi Sad and Belgrade, but throughout Serbia. And in the context of Hungary, the rise of Péter Magyar started after the presidential pardon scandal and the resignation of Hungary's president back at the end of February 2024, after a pedophilia case broke into the political and social circles of Hungary. So in this case, what is very interesting is that both cases have started out as an event-triggered mass outrage. In the Serbian case, that was the railway canopy collapse that took 16 lives, which proved that the system is corrupted to an extent that corruption actually kills or killed or took lives. And in Hungary, once again, a children protection case basically broke all the barriers and showed that a regime or a government that prided itself to be the protector of children failed big time when it came to the real protection of kids. There are some similarities when it comes to the underlying issues that in the past 2.5 years have been fueling the protest as well. I would argue that those two events that I've just mentioned were only the tip of the iceberg. It was more of a trigger rather than the symptom, because the symptom for in both countries or in both contexts can be characterized by growing public dissatisfaction with how the countries would go, especially in the post-COVID period, with a lot of structural and economic issues rising to the surface. Rising level of unemployment, high level of inflation, and a lot of social issues that were untreated by both governments became very much visible and powerful after those events took place back in 2024, which also served as a reminder that those systems are very much corrupted. The system itself lack any kind of accountability or control, but in the same time there have been a lot of desire to re-establish accountability and independent judiciary. So in a sense, um, although those two events that triggered these movements were powerful enough, but I would argue that to be able to maintain the spirit, or let's say the influence of such demonstrations and movements, you needed to have these underlying issues that were for many years were brewing under the surface to recover and to be, let's say, like picked up by those movements as such. Another interesting fact that connects those two movements is that the respective regimes haven't been able to curb the protests, haven't been able to find the magic formula to curb the enthusiasm of the supporters or to do any harm to the leaders, both physically or mentally, to weaken their positions or to curb their enthusiasm as such. Which is very interesting because both in Serbia and in Hungary, but especially in Serbia, there have been many protests, sometimes month-long protests or demonstrations before these mass student-led protests and demonstrations, but all of them proved to be unsuccessful, especially in achieving their political objectives, political or social objectives alike. So the question arises, why exactly are these the long-standing and successful ones or seemingly successful ones? And I would argue is that the underlying issues that I mentioned are pretty much the ones keeping the enthusiasm of the people. Also, what is important is that there is I would argue is that the spirit is still there, which is very important. The organizers of the protests or the prominent actors of those movements have managed to keep up the spirit of the demonstrations for a longer round. And even in the case of Serbia, state-sponsored violence against peaceful protesters wasn't enough to break them, but rather it served as a tool to further boost their enthusiasm, just as the case in Hungary, although violence didn't take place. But seeing the dismissal reaction from the government, it seems that really gave a boost to average Hungarians to join the opposition-led rallies because they could witness that this might be the only chance they have and this might be the successful way to somehow manage to change the system itself. And what is very interesting, both in the Serbian and Hungarian case, is that the age-old smear campaigns employed and used by the governments, respectively, don't work either on the student-led protesters and definitely not on Péter Magyar. Ever since those movements came to prominence, there have been a 24/7 smear campaign targeted against the movement itself or against the leaders of the movement itself, using the same targets and scapegoats, labeling the protesters or Magyar Péter himself as part of the old opposition, labeling them as paid agents of unknown or unnamed Western states or Western secret services. In many cases, in the context of Serbia, those Western states were Croatia and Kosovo, allegedly. In the Hungarian context, and if you do follow Hungarian election campaign right now, it is actually President Zelensky who has somehow managed to find some time to mingle into the Hungarian elections. Excuse my sarcasm. And also, there have been strong narratives when it comes to paid agents coming from quote unquote Brussels in preparation for a quote unquote colorful revolution in an attempt to topple the respective governments. But none of these narratives or none of these scapegoats or targets hit their mark. Because what is very interesting about the student-led movements, but also Péter Magyar, is that they know the system very well. They know all the tricks, especially Péter Magyar, who is actually coming from the circle of the regime. So they can use those tricks also as their greatest weapon against the regime. They use it as a boomerang, which in many cases can backfire at the face of the regime as well, which it did in many times in recent years. Another strong feature for both movements is the fact that they are not limited to the capital, and they are definitely not only limited to, let's say, like to towns and cities, but rather they enjoy a countrywide popularity, also visible in rural parts and municipalities in Serbia and Hungary alike. And why it is extremely important is the fact that in both Hungary and Serbia, one of the major elements or one of the key of Orbán's and Vučić's power lies in the countryside, in the rural communities. And the student-led protests, but also Péter Magyar, are able to successfully reach or target that audience and have their voices heard, which is something that other protesters or other opposition figures from both countries were unable to do so at this point. What is also very interesting in the Serbian context, it's a bit controversial though, is that those movements are also trying to reclaim national symbols and narratives. They usually employ during the protest the national flags, the national coat of arms, alongside with the EU flag in the Hungarian context, Hungarian and Serbian songs, anthem, national songs, and also they don't really have, and in the Serbian context, and this is the controversial part, in many times they do employ Kosovo on their the Kosovo narrative, the thing that Kosovo should still be part of Serbia narrative in their political speeches. Another interesting and I would say very powerful part of these movements is that they only have a little geopolitical and ideological focus. They don't really care about, especially in Serbia, about choosing between the West and the East. The student-led protesters many times stress that our protests right now are not about choosing between the West and the East. There is nothing geopolitical on that. Let's focus on the domestic issues, the structural and the systematic problems. Whereas in Hungary, Péter Magyar doesn't really get into the ideological or identity politics related debates or issues, but rather he doesn't only focus on domestic issues, but in many cases he stressed that Hungary wants to re-establish its own trust within NATO and the EU, which is, although it's a geopolitical, let's say, like desire or focus, but that is definitely not in the heart of his political campaign. And just briefly, the mobilization of different social strata is very important. Just like I mentioned, those protests and movements are not limited to the urban regions of the countries, and they are actually cutting through existing or politically generated cleavages. And lastly, when it comes to the similarities, uh, both movements are very much creative in terms of means of demonstration, in terms of how they organize themselves, in terms of how they keep in touch with their followers. And social media is definitely one of the most powerful toolkits at their disposal. That being said, there are some differences, especially in terms of how the organization of the two movements are being organized. The biggest difference is how is basically the concerns the central figure of the movements. In Serbia, we cannot really pinpoint a certain leader for the student-led protests. There are obviously some prominent figures from the university staff, but we cannot really say that, yes, this is the guy who is the face and the head, the brain behind the movement. Whereas in Hungary, the TISA party or the movement itself is very much a leader-dependent one-man show centered around Péter Magyar. And so far, it really works. And also when it comes to the core, or let's say the founding members of these movements, in Serbia, most of them are university staff and students as well as intellectuals without any ties to the regime. Whereas in the case of Hungary, and I mentioned this before, Péter Magyar actually comes from the circles of the regime, being the former husband of a former justice minister of Orbán's regime. So with that knowledge, he is able to use and abuse the same tactics that the regime employed back in the day against its political enemies to discredit them, which so far worked very well. Also, the means of organization is different. In Serbia, it's a very decentralized movement where a lot of what we can say it's a bottom-up, or let's say like with a lot of grassroots initiatives. Whereas in Hungary, being the movement being a one-man show, it is more of a top-down and centralized movement in terms of how political action is being passed down or passed on from one actor to another. And lastly, the objectives might be a bit similar. Both in Serbia and Hungary, the movements won its snap elections, but I do feel like in the Serbian case, the demonstrators' demands are more abstract in a way that they want structural reforms. And I'm not sure how you would measure, let's say, the success or the fulfillment of such structural reforms, or how would you be able to measure one of the demands or the fulfillments of one of the demands, that is accountability. Whereas in the Hungarian case, I would feel like Péter Magyar has established more concrete demands, including not only more accountability, which is once again not that abstract, but reforms when it comes to, let's say, the child protection system. Last but not least, let me just briefly pull out my foreign policy crystal ball and talk about the future or what lies ahead with regards to, let's say, like the future of the challengers and how they can challenge the systems as well. Serbia, or actually President Vučić, is very much reluctant to announce or call for snap elections. He takes this kind of waiting for Godot mentality, which means that he really much has at this point a wait and see policy. He still wants to find, let's say, the magic tricks through which he can somehow curb the enthusiasm of the student-led protests. And also, he wouldn't mind some help from his foreign policy actors, namely either Putin or President Trump. The possibility for early elections are looming, nevertheless, and political scientists would say that by the end of 2026 or early 2027, there might be at least one elections held in Serbia. That should be the parliamentary elections, which would serve as a huge test to see how the real forces, how the power dynamics are going to be in Serbia after the elections. Whereas in Hungary, it is next Sunday, the big day. And one concern that we all have is that it's one thing to win the elections, and the polls are very much promising, to say the least. I try to curb my own enthusiasm. But another thing is whether a government change can actually be beneficial or can lead to the change of the system, because it has been 16 years, and I don't think that a regime change can actually um, be. It's a good starting point for the change of the system itself, but I don't think that that the change of the government can actually do all the tricks or do wonders, because it has been 16 years. Orbán has all of his loyal men in key positions, and those people are very difficult to move away from their positions. So even if there's a new government in power led by Péter Magyar, he needs to face with a system that is gonna be very hostile towards him. And this is why I question, not only in the Hungarian but also in the Serbian context, that a regime change or change of the government wouldn't necessarily mean the start of a redemocratization process in both countries. So that should be the conclusion. And just very briefly, let me see how bilateral relations have developed since Trump came back to the Oval Office. It is not a surprise to anyone that from the European continent, it is Orbán and then Vučić who can be labeled as the number one cheerleaders of Trump. Even before he came back to power, those leaders and their circles under those leaders actively try to establish links to the circle of Trump, and especially in the case of Hungary, between Hungary and GD Vance, who is actually going to Hungary next week. Those bilateral relations, nevertheless, are built on transactional ties, transactionalism, and those, let's say, like transactionalist ties are actually built on the similar worldviews that those leaders share, especially with regards to the rise and fall of the European Union, as those leaders might predict it, and the fact that we are entering a more multipolar world order. Both Orbán and Vučić have expected, even before Trump got back to the White House, that once there's a new sheriff in town in DC, then they will be able to reap the fruits of their strong political support. Orbán wanted financial and political support during the election campaign from Trump. The biggest desire was that Trump would somehow visit Budapest during the election campaign, which, if you ask me, would have been a powerful gesture. But this didn't seem to materialize so far. Nevertheless, in many occasions, I counted at least 5 occasions in the past 6 months, Trump has publicly adored or gave his endorsement to Orbán, citing him as a wonderful leader, quote unquote, especially in fields of fighting against illegal migration. Vučić also had high hopes when it comes to the return of Trump to the White House. he hoped for a more pro-Serbia or pro-Serbian stances with regards to US foreign policy towards Western Balkans, which has so far hasn't materialized. The US position with regards to Kosovo is still very much unchanged, and sanctioning Serbia's only oil refinery, NIS, is a strong sign that Serbia at this point, or Vučić himself, cannot really expect any kind of favorable position or desired position from Trump. That being said, Vučić also received quite a praise from Trump, but nevertheless, when we compare, let's say, the relations between Trump and Orbán and Trump and Vučić, it is more Orbán who can have who enjoys more benefit, or let's say the trust of the American president rather than Vučić. So I will stop here without any conclusion, because the conclusion is gonna be made in the Hungarian context next Sunday, and then in the Serbian case later this year. But once again, thank you for this opportunity and looking forward to the discussion. I can see that I have some messages, a lot of messages actually in the chat bot that I was in the chat box that I wasn't able to read because I wasn't able to multitask during the presentation. But let me stop sharing my screen and I will have a quick look at the
Okay.
I don't know, at the comments.
I want to clap for you first.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of these are comments. I see at least one question right off the bat from Deggy. Deggy, do you want to ask your question? Where are you? I'm looking for you. There you are.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much for a really timely and important and very insightful presentation. So my question is about the Hungarian election. So you mentioned that even if the upcoming election removes Orbán, it may be difficult to make long-lasting changes in Hungary. But I think a lot of that depends on whether his party can carry the supermajority in the parliament, right? So do you think that's likely to happen? So you mentioned the polls are promising. So like, what is the poll telling us about the kind of general, not only the direction of the votes, but kind of the potential magnitude of changes in at the polls?
Thank you so much for your question. So basically, the polls are telling us that TISA will get into power with a simple majority. The support of TISA is still on the rise. Some polls expect that it's gonna be close to a supermajority. That being said, I cannot imagine a situation in which TISA can pull out a supermajority this time. Because Fidesz Orbán has a steady 1.72 million voters that will, no matter what, will go and vote for Fidesz. And that's a lot. Without a supermajority, without a two-third majority, you can do many, many things, but you cannot, for example, change the so-called cardinal laws. For example, you cannot make changes to the electoral law. You cannot really make any changes to the judicial laws. You cannot even change the constitution, which would be a very important aspect if you wanted to go ahead and redemocratize the country and the system itself. And in a situation when TISA is in power, I can expect some kind of police scenario. Which means that the international reputation of the country will be better, or at least, hopefully, this is not me, doing wishful thinking. But on the other hand, other prominent figures inside of the Hungarian system will try to, block every initiative that TISA, Péter Magyar, would try to make in order to make real, long-lasting changes into the system. The president, ombudsman person, constitutional court members, and the list goes on and on. And the very first challenge is gonna be, and I'm going to send you guys a link in the chat box later on, is the debates on the budget. The budget for next year needs to be approved by a parliamentary committee. The members of the committee cannot be changed at this point. There are 3 members appointed by Orbán. Exactly. If unanimity cannot be reached, the president must call for another snap election. So we are back where we have started. So there are a lot of unknown factors. I mean, those are known factors, but we don't know how those people will react. And I think it's going to be also a test of loyalty versus pragmatism, whether those leaders will be forever loyal to Orbán, having this ride and die mentality for Orbán, or whether they will be like, hey guys, I will adapt to this new situation. Let's turn a page and I will follow what needs to be followed. I'm not sure about that. One day I wake up thinking this, the other day I wake up thinking that. So in that sense, I'm not a good political scientist, I guess. And I'm not the only one. We don't know. This is the topic among us, like Hungarian political scientists. We cannot even guess. We can only map out scenarios. I also wanted to mention something other than that, but I forgot, but I will get back to you once I remember that.
Okay, thank you so much.
So let's go with Eliza. Eliza Fisher has a question.
Thank you. Yeah, there's also an Eliza who has a question.
I know. We'll get to Eliza.
Yeah,
First,
so
Eliza.
I have a couple questions. The first thing is kind of just a thought that I'd like your take on, Ferenc, but then also a question. So my first thought, as I mentioned before we started, the majority of my biggest research so far has been on Ordo Iuris, so I'm familiar a bit more with the Polish angle on this. So I mean, something that I kind of wonder if the challenges that Tisa and then any alternative who arises in Serbia as well would face if they do get into power is similar as we've seen with like Platforma Obywatelska in Poland, where so many illiberal mechanisms were built into the government that you have to do a bunch of work to deconstruct these like crazy back end things that were done before you can actually get productive. But then also something else I know has kind of been a hot talking point since peace was overturned was the like reallowance of abortion, which was like a really hot button issue and something that Tusk and his group ran on really strongly, which they haven't been able to pull through because of like social tensions like that, in part because of how prevalent religion is in Polish public and political life. So I'm wondering about like religion in Serbian and Hungarian political narratives, because like I don't know how prevalent religion is. I mean, as a politico-religious like tool, sorry to be pessimistic about it. I feel pretty confident that it's there, but I'm just kind of wondering in these circumstances, which I'm not as familiar with, how prevalent is that in the political narratives, especially the anti-EU ones?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there is a big difference between Hungary and Serbia in terms of, let's say, like religiousness and how religion is part of the political narrative and discourse. In the Hungarian case, this current government likes to, perceive itself as the protector of the Judeo-Christianity in Europe, labeling itself as a Christian conservative, like religiously driven government. But religion as such or religious institutions don't really have a say in political, in shaping politics. That's not the case in Serbia. In Serbia, the Serbian Orthodox Church is not only powerful, it's not only have a strong say in politics, but also it is very popular among the society. So in the Serbian context, in order for a new regime to be able to, let's say, like come to power or to be able to survive in a longer run, it must have the literal blessings of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is a problem because one of, if not the biggest, let's say, like Russian influence comes to Serbia through the Serbian Orthodox Church. And the Serbian Orthodox Church is, I would say, the strongest bastion of Russian influence, direct influence on Serbian society and politics alike. And when it comes to it was very interesting when you mentioned, Poland and the debates on abortion. What is very interesting that in the Hungarian context, I would have expected some years ago that abortion is gonna be or would be the next topic that would, like emerge as let's say like a new social cleavage or something, a political one. But abortion as a topic hasn't really been that politicized. That being said, there have been some minor restrictions, but not to an extent as in Poland. And I think that also has something to do with religion. Poland is a very religious country. To make abortion basically illegal was pretty much supported by the religious community, the church, the Catholic Church. Whereas in Hungary, the Catholic Church or any other, religious institutions are just not that powerful, not politically speaking, and not definitely in shaping social perceptions on abortion, if we stick to this example.
Great, thank you.
Let's move to Stephen. Stephen, do you still have a question? You had your hand up, or did you put it in the chat?
I think it was a comment, but it's actually.
I'll defer to Lisa. I think she has
Okay.
a kind of my comment or question on
Oh,
Russian
okay.
influence. I was just wondering about Siarto and how the phone call leaked his conversation with Lavrov is playing. But it's a larger question. Elisa has an entire thesis on Russian influence. I'll leave it to her to ask the bigger question.
Yeah, Elisa, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Először is meg akartam köszönni ezt a prezentációt, super érdekes volt. So again, like, thank you. This has been like super awesome. And yes, as Professor Siegel has said, my thesis is kind of like touching on like your broader work, which I really admire. And so like my broader question would be just kind of pertaining to how much you think that like the weaponized corruption that you were like speaking about comes from like Russian influence through like different channels such as like oil or like influence operations, and how much more is it domestically grown and sort of like a specialized to each of these like illiberal parties.
Thank you so much. If you could repeat your question, because my system glitched a bit because I closed the window and then like everything stopped for like 2.5 seconds and I wasn't able to get the second half of your question. So it's about Russian influence.
Yes, it's also in the chat if that makes it easier, because I made it a bit more long-winded than whatever. But it just the second part would be how much do you think it is Russian influence and how much do you think it is domestically grown?
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So in the past 1.5 weeks, my head been spinning nonstop because there have been so many internal political scandals and like skeletons coming out of the closet every day, in the morning and in the afternoon as well, and many of them had a lot to do with Russia and Russian influence over our politicians. Case in point, what our colleagues mentioned with the phone calls between Foreign Minister Siarto and Foreign Minister Lavrov, but also how Russia wanted to, for example, stage an assassination attempt against Orbán, or like not a real assassination attempt, but like a stage for that in order to boost his popularity. So there is Russian influence because Putin is very much interested in keeping Orbán in power, just as Russia is interested in keeping Vučić in power. Because without those two leaders, and especially without Orbán, Putin would lose a direct access to EU decision making, or at least to the potential of influencing EU level decision making negatively in a way that it can no longer, let's say, like through the help of Hungary and now Slovakia, sidetrack Europe or sidetrack European decision making, or prolong it, or even, like put a wedge between European partners. I would say weaponized corruption comes. I would say weaponized corruption doesn't really come from Russia. I am certain, but I don't have any, like hard evidence to say it, that there are Hungarian top politicians getting a fat paycheck from Russia. That will be, the historian's task to unravel it once those files are open or would be open. But I think when it comes to corruption, Russia obviously, like appreciates a regime that is inclined to do corruption. But also in the Hungarian case, the main source of corruption were EU funds. So this is where I'm usually very much critical with regards to the EU itself, because it should have introduced more monitoring and stronger monitoring mechanisms when it comes to how those EU funds, cohesion funds, and we are talking about billions of euros, are being handled in member states or by member states' governments, including Hungary. So the corruption was, I would say, always there. It is one of the driving forces of the government or the governments of Serbia and Hungary. And it's just an added bonus that Russia can once again use this channel, because our politicians are pretty much open to do shady business with Russia in exchange for, and I will let you finish the sentence because I don't really know the answer.
No, that makes sense. Nagyon szépen köszönöm, és mondom, csodálatos prezentáció, köszönöm.
Köszönöm.
If I may, if you allow me, we're bombarding, but the very fact that we have so much interest and commentary, underscores how important actually the topic that you're, so wonderfully talked about and put it in comparative perspective. I'd be interesting on your observations in a comment, because again, all of us are holding our breaths, as what comes next Sunday. And I think it's not only a bellwether for Hungarian and European politics, but I would argue because of the disproportionate attention that's been paid. I mean, J.D. Vance, nonetheless, right? Traveling. So that also spells, a broader, or signals broader tendencies for the future of this attempted populist revolution and counter revolution, if you want to call it, in Europe and in the West and so on, which is in tune, of course, with other political regimes. So my question, however, is because you've shared something which I think by Anne Applebaum, which is profound. So we are seeing probably the first post-reality campaign. And for someone that is inclined and very much interested in the the capabilities of cognitive warfare and post-reality and such, have you seen any new elements in terms of disinformation, in terms of manipulation and so on in this particular campaign in Hungary that is different from what we saw before, meaning, the billboards and, Soros and everything else, that we have been witnessing and talking and writing about. But what is quantitatively or qualitatively new in your opinion, having in mind what Anne, is boldly stating as this is kind of like a new level?
I think the current election campaign in Hungary took disinformation to a whole new level. disinformation became the central part of the political narrative. It's not only, let's say, like it doesn't only come from, let's say, like fringe sources, but it comes from the central authorities. And the biggest novelty, which is like very worrisome or should be worrisome to other countries where elections are approaching, is the use of AI, the use and abuse of AI, and especially on social media. In Hungary, the most popular social media platform is Facebook. Especially among, like generations that were socialized under socialism, which is kind of a problem at this point because those generations, and I'm not age shaming anyone, but they didn't really have any trainings, quote unquote, on media literacy. So they were socialized in a way that what you hear on TV or radio or what you read
The
is the
truth.
truth, but nothing but the truth. And this is the kind of what goes around comes around kind of situation because they are very much the recipients of those AI videos, AI and deep fake. I mean, AI videos of Péter Magyar saying this and that obviously were not only taken out of context, but they are that Péter Magyar never said those sentences. He was never in that situation. So it's like 100% made up. And
Ferenc,
they honestly they look very real, even for me.
can you comment? Well, the thing is that, it's a huge challenge, and that's why our university as well, used to and does have like really heavy research program, in terms of because it's a not only a threat to the political order, but we argue it's a national security threat, about the deep fakes and so on. So we have people
Absolutely.
like Professor Bobby Chesney and so on. It's really hard to regulate those things. But can you, just out of curiosity, because one of the campaign here was marked by supposedly rocking scandal, right? The one that touched the intimate life of Magyar and so on. Have we seen like a proliferation of AI or fake videos and so on that were kind of like going in and around the topics of sex scandals and so on? This is what something I thought that this was thought as a sure way to derail thesis campaign, and obviously did not work, as intended.
Mm-hmm.
It's a compromise.
When it comes to AI videos, those served or try to serve two purposes. One is to discredit Magyar, to have him say things that he has never said. And the second is to portray Ukraine or President Zelensky as the big bad guy. So, like what used to be Soros 10 years ago is now President Zelensky in the election campaign, or more broadly, portraying Ukraine as the bad guy. So most of the AI videos serve the purpose of generating fear among the society that if TISA wins, then your kids and grandkids and fathers would go to the Ukrainian front lines alongside Zelensky. Did they work? I hope not, but honestly, at this point, I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much. I
But
know that I've bombarded you with questions, but because it's at least in my household, it's so anticipated, is what it will, have, what kind of results, because we know, not only the symbolic value, but how much actually is at stake and invested. Because as you have pointed out with Vučić, right? The very survival of this governments and those regimes will be used as a counterpoint, to the decadent liberal democracy worldwide and so on. So basically, the stakes are much more than Serbia and Hungary. I would argue for sure.
Sure. And I know from the context of Serbia that, politicians in Serbia as well as a society are also closely watching the elections in Hungary, because if Orbán like if Orbán is defeated more or less democratically in a free but not fair environment, those might give an extra boost to the protesters as well. But in a more, let's say, like broader European context, the loss of Orbán will definitely send shockwaves to similar leaders, to the patriots for Europe. Let it be the Czech Republic, Austria, Germany, or France, that basically, yeah, it's gonna be a snowball effect, that the biggest one or the strongest one or the founding member of this Patriots for Europe movement is the one who got out of power in Hungary. So what that will mean to us in the future. So it's definitely a bellwether elections, or a tiebreaker, or make it or break it, how you wanna want it. Yeah, a tipping point for sure.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I want to ask a question. This will be the last, I promise, question that we'll have today in this session. And it relates to oil and gas, which you kind of brought up. And I'm just wondering how that fits into kind of the relationships between Hungary and Serbia with Russia. And then solidified through pipelines, through refineries, through, infrastructure, trade, but also how sanctions against Russia, whether they're followed or not by Hungary, have disrupted that, and kind of the Trump US role in that, because most recently it's the US sanctions, which seems to run counter to that. But I know Hungary's delayed. There's a lot of delay going on. But then how does that, Trump's relationship, I suppose, to Orbán, how do the sort of US sanctions against Russia disrupt that sort of underlying kind of ties?
I would have expected that. So President Trump, I would say, I cannot judge if that was a conscious or unconscious decision, but he managed to successfully decrease the dependence of Russian fossil fuels, the dependence on Russian fossil fuels for certain European countries in Southeast Europe especially, which made, like many regimes, find themselves in an uneasy position. Case in point, Serbia and Nis. Which was also a huge opportunity for Hungary's oil refinery MOL, because it is set to acquire or purchase the Russian shareholds within Serbia's Nis company with US approval, because for that transaction you need the US approval for sure, or for certain. I would say when it comes to Hungary, Russian oil and gas, and US, so there's Menage a Trois. It's very challenging. So on paper, I mean, it's not on paper, but President Trump allegedly gave Hungary some extension when it comes to decoupling from Russian fossil fuels. Also, Hungary has some kind of exemption at the EU level up until next year. But that being said, in recent months, Hungary has signed some memoranda of cooperation or understanding with American companies in the fields of increasing American LNG, the amount of LNG that will come to Hungary, and also some deals with regards to American companies possibly installing small nuclear power plants in Hungary, once again decreasing the reliance on Russian fossil fuels in the country. But I would say it is vital for this Hungarian regime to keep its energy dependency towards Russia. This is basically the strongest ties in terms of, let's say, like from a technical point of view, that binds two countries together. If we, like take out the synergies between political actors. I expect that the new government will will gradually decrease this dependency just to re-establish trust with Western partners, and also possibly to have, let's say, a more or less favorable position in the eyes of Trump. So I expect more, let's say, like American influence, European, but also American influence in the energy sector, especially in Hungary after the elections or a regime change.
Well, thank you so much. I think we need to have you back at some point, so we'll probably reach out, or maybe have you come to Texas at some point. So keep in touch.
It was my pleasure. I had a fantastic time. So thank you very much once again for organizing this
Thank you.
this entire Balkan Circle series. It's an awesome initiative. Keep up the good work, Guy.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
one last question about the elections. Do the returns come out really quickly, or is it going to take a while before we know?
Usually the returns are pretty fast. So I would say we should know more or less the final results by late afternoon, Texas and DC time.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll be watching for that.
Great.
So usually let's say like votes are counted, let's say like 98% of the votes are counted by 11 o'clock Hungary time, which means late afternoon hours in the US. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you
Yes.
for having me.
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah.